Hello, welcome to the panel discussion part of IRConf. Been looking forward to this a lot. My name is Jason English. I'm a principal analyst at Intelix. I have done a lot of research in this space. Our firm has a cross-cutting focus on digital transformation, but incident management is obviously a big part of that. Anyway, I guess to kick things off, we have a really good panel here. So I'd like to introduce our panelists briefly. Actually have you introduce yourself. So let's start out with introduce yourself and what briefly is your stake in incident management. Christine?
Hi, I'm Christine. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Honeycomb. For anyone not familiar, Honeycomb is all about enabling engineering teams to understand their software in production through observability. And so we are very interested in incident response because that is part of, that is the primary pain point that folks come to us through, trying to understand what is happening and why it is deviating from their expectations.
Oops, Jason, I think you might have muted there.
Oh yeah, ETL, would you like to go?
Yeah, sure. Can I go?
Yes.
Great. So, hey, my name is ETL Schwartz. I'm the CTO and co-founder of Commodore, a startup designed to help dev and DevOps to troubleshoot much faster and more efficiently in Kubernetes environments. I've worked a lot as a DevOps, and I spent most of my days, troubleshooting. Wrote a bit of code and a lot of troubleshooting. So that's me.
Excellent. Pedro?
Yeah, hi, I'm Pedro Canahuati. I'm a CTO at 1Password. 1Password is a password management tool, productivity tool that effectively allows you to make sure that you're using single unique passwords for single sites and doing the right thing and having good security hygiene online.
Awesome. And John, we've seen you in some earlier sessions today. Would you do a brief intro too?
Sure. I'm John. I'm a CEO and a co-founder here at Kintaba. We're a platform to help organizations implement best practices for incident response as an off-the-shelf solution. So one click, sign up, responding to incidents tomorrow type of an interaction. So we are pretty excited to be part of this, obviously, and helping to put this event on.
Excellent. Well, we seem to have quite a few attendees here. So during the session, make sure and ask your questions in the Q&A window to the right. So I'll be fielding those later, but we have a couple things to start things off. You know, I spent most of my professional career running sales and marketing for software development and testing vendors, actually. And so, you know, dealing with incident management wasn't something that we had to do unless it was evolved to a crisis situation. So we would, you know, often have to deal with issues coming in, whether those were support tickets from things like Remedy or Jira, or just having to deal with issues on our wiki and stuff like that to answer questions. And by the time it makes it there, it's generally not a very positive situation for us. So I think a good topic for this is really, you know, evolving a positive incident culture where we can really, you know, flip the script on how we approach incidents and how we can treat these as more, you know, positive effects on customer experience and the experience of our employees, because, you know, that's equally as important for having a sustainable, resilient organization, as making sure that the people who have to support customers are having a good experience as well. So I think a good place to start would be just, you know, in what meaningful ways do you think that a positive incident or resiliency culture has impacted your company? Christine, if you'd like to start that one, that'd be a great place.
Sure. I will start with a sort of pointy-haired boss answer, which is being open about how we handle incidents and how we focus on learning from them has frankly helped a lot with hiring. You know, as folks think about the environments that they want to be in and types of people they want to engage with, you know, engineers are smart. They know how much the cultural and kind of social practices of a team impact the technical work that they, you know, want to be doing.
Yeah, exactly. So does anybody else have an interesting thought on that? How has it impacted your company at TL?
Yeah, I will say the main focus is it helps us improve our velocity. I think that in the end of the day, when you try to move fast, and we constantly do, things are going to break. Like, you are going to have incidents. Like, it's not a question of like, can I prevent it? It is going to happen. And once the culture is okay, let's learn and improve for the next time, and let's make sure that we have the right safeguards in place. Every time after an incident, it makes the developers feel much more confidence when they are deploying their code to production and when they are like putting changes. I think having like a culture which which people are not afraid, because they know that worst case, the company knows how to handle incidents and things are going to improve, is really helped us to achieve the speed that we are currently operating in. So mainly velocity.
Yeah, very good. Pedro, do you have any thoughts on that? How has a positive incident or resiliency culture impacted your company?
Yeah, I think sort of in addition to what Christine was saying about hiring and learning and ETL, sort of about velocity, I think it generally actually just breeds a culture of innovation in teams. I think that it allows engineers to recognize that they can go and try some new things, and while they can't be reckless about it, and we have to write the right tools, and we have to make sure that they have the right guardrails with pushing things out to production. Making a mistake used to come with it the fear of being fired. And so as companies change their culture and they change their way of thinking about incidents in more of a learning mode and to increase velocity, the engineering culture changes into an innovative one, because they'll take a few more risks if they can reduce the blast radius of those risks. And I think it just brings a lot more rapid innovation to the company and the products that anybody offers.
Yeah, John. I mean, you've been talking about this today, but how has it affected your company? I mean, you're kind of founded on that principle, but how does it play out in your firm?
Yeah, we certainly had a requirement, right, to have it early because it was dog fooding of our own products. But at the same time, having that process in place on day one when you're a startup, and you're interviewing, especially your first set of employees, and you're starting to grow, a lot of the questions that tend to come in have to do with things like, well, what do you and don't you have a process for? Right. And that line is only very slowly moving in the early days from a stance of, early on, you might say, well, we don't have any processes for anything. I'm not quite sure how you're going to get paid, but we're going to work that out. And I think it was pretty impactful early on to have the incident response process in place from day one, because one of the things we could say is one of the big things we know how to do is deal with emergencies, failures, critical situations. And that's already there. So of all the things you're going to panic about when you're here, right? You're going to panic about, customer growth and releasing the right features and building the right things, but you're not going to panic about what happens when something goes wrong. And we know things are going to go wrong, and that's why the process is there. And I think that's a little bit of an offshoot of what Pedro was saying as well, right? Which is people look for companies to join, and what Christine was saying from a recruiting standpoint. This is what people are joining companies for, is they want to go and create, and they don't want to join to go and figure out how to deal with the company when it's panicking, right? That should just be there in an inherent state, and that requires a pretty interesting tool chain. But I think that's where that like positive culture comes from. It's like one more piece of process you have in place that's focused around keeping things positive, right? It's like it's your safety net from things devolving into finger pointing and anger, and it also does a couple of nice things around metrics, where you can already know coming in that the organization isn't going to start doing horrible metrics types things, like our goal is to never have an incident, right? Like that's like, okay, let's never work at that company or for that manager. And so I think very much like I try to pitch a lot to like very small companies, 2, 3, 4 people. It's like just get some semblance of your incident culture in place on day one, and it'll really help you out in those early days.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's a great way to transition to kind of the next topic, because we talk about startups can actually engender this from the beginning, whereas larger companies, they actually need to adopt this almost as it needs to attain the level of executive visibility, right? Because they start to realize how important it is to their entire product offering. So, as a leader, how do you seed and manage that kind of culture without it feeling like this forced edict from the top, right? Christine, as a leader, how do you do that in your own organization, and what have you seen so far?
Yeah. A little bit of a cheat code, which is that first, as a startup, we have been very intentional about the foundational behaviors we want to bring in. And the second cheat code is my co-founder is, dyed-in-the-wool ops person who has brought in quite a bit of, you know, understanding of constructive behaviors and destructive behaviors. And so this is something that we pay attention to. Again, this goes back to hiring for culture, hiring for and looking for how people have dealt with panicking situations or stressful situations in the past. And one of the things that we really love seeing from we have a pretty wide mix of folks who are super experienced and folks who are fairly new to on call, and a thing that we love seeing from the experienced folks is demonstrating a willingness to talk about having messed up in the past, telling those war stories, but focusing on what folks learned about it, so that that's the emphasis of any incident rather than fear around getting fired.
Itiel, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think like waking up in the middle of the night, it's never fun, right? And when your boss is telling you to do it, it's probably even less fun. I see it as a question of ownership. Like you need to have the developers have the feeling that they own their service end to end. And by doing this, it is part of their job is like writing it, adding the test, but also troubleshooting it or responding to incident in the middle of the night. So I think the best way to achieve it is to make sure they also gain something. To tell them we hired you because you guys are the best. We want you to have full ownership because we trust you. In order to achieve full ownership, you have to do it. You have to take part in the on-call. You have to know how to manage your system. And I think it's like a question of what's in it for me, right? As a developer, why should I do it? And I think like the best response is you are becoming a better developer or a more like senior developer or a DevOps by doing so.
Emily talked about this. Sorry, just to jump in really quickly, this morning, right around like positive accountability, right, and like how that's a good thing to be able to absorb, versus the other side of that, right, which is like the blame and negative responsibility. So I think that's really cool to hear.
I think what's also interesting is in the moment, I think Christine was sort of trying to allude about this. The senior leadership team needs to know how to react and respond in those situations. The worst thing that can happen is that an engineer is trying to fix a problem, and you've got some pointy-headed exec saying, "What the fuck happened? Excuse me, what just happened?" And like, why didn't we do X, Y, and Z? Versus sort of a senior leader coming in and giving people room to understand what's the problem, how are you going to solve it, how do you recognize that the problem has been resolved. And then the follow up after that in the incident management meetings, making sure that you even have a ceremony where you repeat the reasons why you're there and the reasons why you think it's important to learn, and that you want people to be honest about what led them to that incident rather than who caused it and who's to blame. I think the most important thing on those sort of meetings, depending on the size of your company, obviously, but and how often you do them, is that the senior leaders need to show up for people. They need to be there to help them and foment that culture, not to blame them on anything. And if the senior leaders show up in that way in a collaborative environment, if they're involved in the incident, they're on Slack, they're asking the right questions, they're doing the block and tackle so that people can solve the problem, then that's going to make the engineering team, just an operations team, honestly, feel a lot more comfortable with the situation.
In a lot of companies, like even just the acknowledgement of senior leadership that the practice of responding to an incident is something that's a positive action within the organization for the actor is unique. We talk to a lot of customers where they're hiding this stuff from senior leaders, right? They're worried about openness, because the more open it is, right, these are cultures of keeping it quiet, keeping it down, keeping it hidden. I remember, when I first started at Facebook, finding the incident management tool there and being able to just see everything, the entire history, at least as far as I was concerned, of all the things that had gone wrong, and the people who'd been involved in them, and how almost pedestrian it was for a lot of them, not all, for most of them though, for being this is just something we're dealing with, and we're going through the motions, and then we're doing it again, and then we're doing it again, and then we're doing it again. And I think when you're introducing, an organization to tooling top down, right, you really want that tool to kind of own the propagation of information from an openness standpoint more than a wiki page or like a forced learning session where everyone comes in and like sits in front and you say, this is how we're going to act now. That was really powerful for me. It was just like watching people use, a tasks tool or, another tool where you sort of learn from seeing how other people act. Pedro, I think you were there long enough ago that there were even before that world was probably the positive rainbows and unicorns that I saw. But yeah, I think like that kind of like inside out propagation with top down acknowledgement, and appropriate involvement, I thought was pretty unique and cool to see.
One of the kind of mental models we had when we were building our product was, how do we capture and support a scenario where there's a Charity, the ops expert, who knows how to debug an incident, and a Christine, the clueless dev, who like wants to learn. Speaking of senior leaders being quite open, Itiel, you described yourself as someone who wrote a little bit of code and debugged many incidents. I would describe myself as someone who has written a lot of code and caused a lot of incidents. And we're open with this we're open about this with our new hires, and it's this acknowledgement that production and incidents are terrifying for a lot of folks. And how do we enable, again, the folks who are doubly terrified of going up to the ops person to ask, how did you debug that? Because I would like to learn, and finding ways that don't just rely on the active knowledge transfer of the experienced person saying, this is what I did and this is what you should do, but finding ways, again, for tooling to support passive knowledge transfer, to simulate that, like, watching someone over the shoulder, even in a distributed world.
One of the things that we started to put into place at Facebook Now Meta before I left was capturing some of those debug sessions in the tool itself. Is actually saying, like, I ran this command on the command line in my dev box to sort of debug this thing, and then we captured that later. So again, other people could learn from that in the future and say, oh, that was a cool trick to find that information or to solve that problem. So I thought that was a sort of additional added bonus of, to John's point, the tooling can reinforce your culture in that respect.
I love the idea, Christine, of it not being strange to have caused an incident. It's like not a unique characteristic of someone inside of the organization. It's so common that the CEO's done it, in recent enough memory that they'd be able to tell you what that incident was that they caused. Sort of the idea that you're almost weird if you haven't, right? It's almost like maybe you're not being creative enough. Like if we're not making any mistakes here. I think it's interesting to think about the world almost flipped on its head, right? Like in a complete world of positivity around incidents. You maybe aren't encouraging them in that you're hoping to break things, but you've set things up in a way where breaking is the knowledge that you're almost pushing, like there's the wall, like there's kind of the edge of what we can do. And we hit it early enough and often enough that we don't accidentally end up, 1,000 miles on the other side of it when we realize we're there.
I think as you're talking about that, John, and I think I know a little bit about Christine's company and sort of how it operates, given some of the folks that I know there. The one good thing about being able to give people this opportunity to be able to break things is, can you fix them quickly? Can you roll back a change, or can you roll forward really, really fast? Because if you can do that, then it gives people a little bit more comfort to be able to break things and recognize that the recovery is fast. In the decades ago, it was very difficult to roll things out, and you had the handoff between sort of developers and operation and QA and so on and so forth, and there was a long pipeline of changes that had to go through and buy-in and acceptance to be able to actually get something fixed in production. Just get it out to production, not alone fix it. But now a lot of the companies just really focus a lot on how do you roll that out quickly so that you can recover quickly if you see that mistake, right?
Yeah, that's pretty fascinating. So I've one more topic to kind of get into, because I had a little bit of history with this in the past, like at ITKO, when we developed a freemium version of our, very expensive software, right? And we thought, well, there'd be a lot of goodwill and people would appreciate it a lot, but we kind of had a self-service support system behind it, and it didn't generate the kind of positivity that I expected out of that, because people don't like where you draw the line between freemium and paid software. So that was the kind of lesson we had to take away from that. Um, and eventually either you had to make the decision to either shut it down or keep going, right? And you don't want to get in that situation. So what are some of the learnings that you've had from your biggest incidents that you've discovered so far? I don't know if Christine, you have a good example, or
I can start again.
Someone to jump in.
It's cool. It's cool.
I'm always throwing it to you first.
Honestly, I think given that my journey in dealing with incidents has come from a place of you're never going to be able to predict what will go wrong, and that's what you will learn. I think that the idea of like unexpected learnings is like you're always learning something new, and that is the status quo. I think that from our stance as an observability vendor, we are, I get to hear like all sorts of different customer stories, and I think the one that I most delight in are the sorts where folks didn't even realize there was an incident happening. Right? When you're looking at something super high level, when you are used to aggregate stats, it is easy to be like, oh, well, the entire system looks healthy. Great. And I love it. I love seeing our engineers, our customers recognize, oh, crap, it is completely broken for this one subset of users or customers. And for them, they're having a alarm bells situation. And I think those always end up the most interesting because, getting to dig in and understand what the boundaries are of that failure, of that unexpected behavior, usually different every time, and serve to focus folks' energy on interesting parts of the system. This is a fuzzy answer. I know our SRE is giving a talk in a couple hours. Fred Hebert, he will do a much better job of going and deep diving into these. I don't want to take up all the airtime.
Great. Itiel, do you have any big incident
Lessons?
survival stories?
I have tons. I have tons of big incidents. I think like the thing that I don't know like did the most impact for me. I've done something like really really awful back then. I was a young developer and I broke like a very big part of the system, but no one noticed for a couple of hours. And I'm the one that found out, and I fixed it, and I told everyone. And I felt quite bad. Like I was a young developer, I messed up a critical production system that cost the company quite a lot of money, and I'm feeling bad. And like the day after, I went to the daily, like everyone, and one of the most senior developers, one of the best I ever met, said yesterday I accidentally deleted all of the production database. I was sure I'm in dev, but I somehow like deleted the production. And the world didn't crash. Like people didn't shout at him. Like it was very chill. And I really felt like it happens to everyone. I think like the first lesson I learned when troubleshooting or like when you fuck up something like very like major is it's like people say it here, it's like some sort of rite of passage. Like it will happen to you if you are going to push the limits, if you are going to try to move fast, if you are going to try to do like a lot of and fast things are going to break, and you are not the first one who deleted a database or did something in production. And I think it's something that like for me it was really eye-opening back then, and like I'm still trying like to have the same kind of mentality and culture for new hires in my company. Like, okay, so you're going to deploy something and it's going to be bad. So how are we going to know about it and how are we going to fix it? But it is okay. Like it will happen to you. It's not a question of like will, but
oftentimes to follow up on what Itiel was saying and a little bit of Christine's commentary, you have to give folks air cover in the moment. So one of the things that we learned in some of our largest incidents at Facebook is that every once in a while we had to make a really tough call and disrupt some other service or disrupt something. Say, for example, our advertising system or our messaging system or our newsfeed. And the engineers who are proposing those ideas or the operations folks that are proposing those aren't sure that they can make that call. And so, there again, like if I take advertising down, is that okay? When you have a senior in the room or in the IRC chat or Slack or whatever, who can say that's okay, yes, we should do that. I think that's the right move forward. Don't worry, there will be no consequences to you. I'll be the one that has to take the consequences later. It just allows a lot more freedom of sort of creativity in solving a problem, because people aren't necessarily, again, worried that they can't propose something that might be a little bit radical in the moment. I remember one of the worst incidents that I was involved in, we actually had to take Facebook down completely because we had made a privacy change that was not well vetted, and we caused a database problem, like Itiel was saying. And I had to tell the engineer who was going to take the site down, it's okay, you won't get fired. Please take it down. Like that was the approach that we had taken, was privacy matters above anything else, and we needed to make sure that we were protecting our users and their data, and that engineer who was going to take it down was not going to get fired for it.
I think we had, when we were looking into insights, early on, one of the big ones, it's somewhat related to Christine's point about, what can you see in your metrics, and what can't you see. And we found the vast majority of our incidents were human sourced. They weren't necessarily the result of something that, you can watch a lot of high level data on your site. You can watch egress, you can watch like hits, you can watch page renders and 500 errors, like all of these things you can watch. But the things that actually turn into incidents, especially when you're small and growing, similar to Dave Renzen's talk earlier, right, are actually customer events. Right, it's something that's wrong that has manifested as an incident for your customer, a large group of your customers as you scale, right? Or maybe early on, just one really high value or highly valued customer, where their incident is your incident now, right? And it's going to be filed, and it doesn't necessarily have a good piece of metric behind it, and your alerting system certainly didn't catch it, right? And it's a very human process of determination around the fact that the incident is happening at all, and then the assignment of its level, and then progressing forward from that. And initially, it was tough for us. Like, it actually, in the early days, it would always kind of come back to me. It's like, well, John, it's a customer thing, so where does it go? Like, you're the CEO. Decide, is it a Sev 1? And just like you really want to assign accountability and autonomy and ability to all of your responders, sort of giving that capability across the company early on to try to establish the fact that these aren't going to stop happening. Our the type of business we are, a lot of our incidents are going to be customer sourced types of incidents, where the determination of is the incident open or closed even comes back to, well, does the customer say it's closed, right? Like not just have like the numbers gone back where they ought to be. Like I've always said, the worst incident isn't when your whole board is red, it's when your whole board's green, right? It's like everything's good, but and I think that it hasn't backed off at all, and I think in fact has become more and more true as we've gone forward, and it's helped us to capture and expand the use. It's going to sound serving for me to say you should use incident management for more things, right? You should bring more of your company on with Kintaba, but really, it's very true from the standpoint of you can expand that scope, and you can really apply these good practices, to all sorts of different parts of the business. And occasionally, there isn't even an engineer involved in the response process. There can be incidents that that are legal, that are customer success type. And I think that was a really big learning for us coming in, because we're technically minded folks. We're all engineers. We all sort of came into it mostly expecting, what happens when when our cloud host goes down, and it turns out Kintaba doesn't run it at Facebook scale. We're not inventing new metaphors for how to scale a business from a technical standpoint. So that stuff stays pretty static, but we still have incidents all the time that aren't necessarily from that type of sourcing.
Yeah, that's fascinating. We have thanks everybody for asking some questions. We have some really good ones. I'm going to start off with the most popular one here from Eric. I really do like this because it I think it really speaks to the heart of like, how do you get an organization to adopt? How do you persuade developers who are reluctant to join on-call rotations of the benefits and growth that come from experience and skills in incident response? Just leave open net. Who wants to jump in
Sure.
first?
I'll get started. I think, those of us that have developed services in production always have an idea of what they're supposed to do. But in reality, what actually happens in production is very different than what we had envisioned in our mind, and the steps that the algorithm took, or the code paths that it took. And having that knowledge of what it's actually doing in production, you will gain that during an incident. And oftentimes people recognize that what they've written isn't what they thought was supposed to happen. And if they're not involved in that, they'll never gain that insight. And I generally try to appeal to people's better nature on wanting to build a better service, right? Like you want to build a better product. You don't want to build one that doesn't do what you anticipated it was going to do, or didn't have the functionality that you thought it had. So you need to get involved in the incidents to understand whether or not the resiliency that you thought you built into your service is actually occurring in that moment. And in fact, it might not. And having the knowledge that you're the one that built it and you're the one that can fix it, it just enables a lot of different behaviors in people.
I love the idea of, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please. John, do you have a opinion on this, on how to persuade developers?
I think I love the idea of both rewarding participation in the space, and rewarding doesn't have to be, anything like pithy. It can be, anything huge. It can be as simple as what like Google does, right? Where they have a fix of the week each week, and it's just brought up the fact that someone did this and their name is relevant to the rest of the company for some of the work that they did. And I think that's always a little bit of a carrot. But beyond that, I think, good organizations recognize impact, right? And good engineers tend to be looking for ways to have more impact. And I think if you're not treating incidents as a negative, so if you've accomplished the things we talked about earlier around positive culture and top-down, involvement, then I think the idea of participating in incident response as a way to have additional impact on the organization is a pretty interesting way to sort of phrase it. It's like, here's another thing you can do, as an engineer to have more impact, especially at the most critical moments of the company, and that impact will be recognized. Sort of the human-centric metric side of all of this, right? And I think that speaks to a lot of engineers, versus just you need to do it because your name is up and it's on your job description.
Well,
yeah. ETL, did you have a thought on that? How do you incentivize or encourage it? Or?
Yeah, I think you must have a couple of role models inside your company that are the people that other developers inspire to be. And you need, like John said, like you need to encourage it. You need to like celebrate quick wins or like incident wins. But you must have those people that people just look up to, and to see them doing the on-call and seeing them like sharing how hard it was or how easy it was, basically to share everything. So people will say, oh, I want to be like John. I want to be better in like managing incidents. And I think having a positive role model is very, very like, it's like super critical to the success of creating this kind of culture. If you don't have those kind of like champions, I think it will be much harder for the organization to do the shift, because you have to have them in place.
As a developer who was terrified to join the on-call rotation, lots of thoughts. Tactical and philosophical. A tactical thing that we do that I've loved seeing is we do primary and secondary rotations. Of course, it necessitates that your team is large enough, but as you get to a certain point, having primary and secondary basically follow each other. You're secondary the week before you are primary. And so the idea for someone who's scared is that as secondary, you can ride along on everything that the primary does. You're not responsible for anything, but you're responsible for being there and sort of learning. And I think that is a really cool sort of lower stakes way to learn the ropes of incident response. Philosophical piece. There's a lot of kind of aspiration and yes, you should focus on impact. I like a different tack. When you think about what developers do all day, writing codes and writing tests, what are you doing in tests if not comparing your expected behavior against actual behavior? And that actually translates incredibly well to production, because we're talking about incident response as a practice, but it takes place in an environment that is foreign and scary. It can be scary, right? Production. What is production? Oh gosh, it's where things go wrong. It's where, people do unexpected things. And helping developers see that the skill sets they already have and hopefully take pride in translate well, like it's another path to, and like, look, you're already sort of set up to be good at this, and it'll be good for you, and it'll help you be a better engineer. One caveat here, again, is that many production tools do not speak the language of developers. This comes from the sort of traditional monitoring, world where high cardinality data is hard. Guess what? Everything in the developer world, everything in your test cases is high cardinality data. You're using test user IDs, you're testing specific logic paths, you're testing these things that don't live in a traditional monitoring world. And so every time we talk about observability, we emphasize, your tool should be flexible enough to speak the language of developers, so that when they're looking at something in production, when they're trying to understand an incident, they're not trying to figure out why CPU throughput went up, CPU usage is off the charts and write throughput went up on their Mongo database. They're trying to figure out why, errors or latency are up for this one endpoint for your most important customer. Things that they can understand and map back to the code and debug. That is how you help developers feel comfortable in production and on-call rotations. In addition to all of the, again, team and social pieces that the other panelists mentioned.
Excellent. Yeah, so it's kind of a good follow-on. What sorts of successful implementations of on-call reimbursement or incentives have you seen? I don't know if it's a common practice, but I'm just curious if anybody here has applied that beyond sort of the just the recognition aspect that we've kind of touched on here a little bit. So like says paid, he said, like, i.e. getting paid overtime, extra time off, or other sorts of reimbursement for this process. Is that happening out there, or what do you see so far? Does anybody have a thought on that?
So for just being honest in this space, we don't do that kind of rewards, here for on-call. You can be rewarded for your on-call work mostly through the output of that, right? Just like you would expect to be able to be rewarded, for your output, as an engineer or even as a non-engineer. And I think that, again, it's about kind of taking this out from the outside and saying, well, these are error cases and they're unusual, right? And sort of pulling them into, well, it's just sort of part of what we do. And if you do it well, just like everything else, we're doing a good job of record keeping so that we know those things. It is really important to know, who are on your rotations. Are you being fair about those rotations? Are they being established in ways where people don't feel like it's just being thrust upon them, at unexpected moments, and there's no way to trade them off. I think you can end up in situations where, the structure of your on-call like implies that there should certainly be like additional incentive behind it because it's going to be so terrible. And so I don't think we've gone down that path, but I'm not sure if Christine, Pedro, or ATL, if you guys have run into that, in terms of that type of an incentive, outside of maybe like the contracting world.
We don't do anything formally, but we do encourage our people, and then our managers especially, that, look, if you had an especially rough on-call night, week, something went wrong, and take a day off the next week. It's much more fluid and up to people's subjective judgment, which is why it needs to be reinforced that it's okay and encouraged. But I think I think we would struggle to put same parameters around a formal reimbursement program like that.
I guess they map back kind of into like, positive mental health management, like across the organization in general, right? Is if you were up till 6 a.m., no one's going to come down on you for not signing into Slack at whatever, 9 o'clock, hopefully not, but whatever that early time is to come and be available. And it feels like these are maybe upstream problems, right? That like are sort of solvable at a higher level, where it's not just on call, right? There are all sorts of different functions in your work that can be overly exhausting if you catch them at the wrong moments. And knowing that the company you work at is effective at giving you space when necessary and otherwise sounds, yeah, that's a really good way to phrase it, Christine. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I've encountered the requests often. I've never implemented them. I don't actually think that incentivizing people with money or anything like that to do on call is really the right behavior to encourage, in my opinion. What we did, though, in some cases where on call situations were heavy, they were very sort of exhausting, is we flipped the incentive slightly and said, if you help us make on call better, if you start solving some of these problems to prevent it from happening in the future, or making it easier for your colleagues to get better at it, then when it came to performance management and performance evaluations, they would get accolades for that and they would get rewards in those mechanisms, as opposed to sort of like monetary or very focused, formalized PTO, time off in lieu, et cetera, et cetera. By the way, that's also like irrespective of some countries or jurisdictions actually do require it, but that's a different story. But generally, if you can incentivize the behavior you're looking for instead, people will actually gravitate towards that. If my job is to actually make on call better, that's what I'm going to go do, right? And then if I get rewarded for that as an individual and I have better performance and potential promotions in the future, et cetera, that in my mind will drive the right behavior.
Yeah, I mean, we've gone from a point of view where the main incentive was for developers to put more features into the basket, but then what is the incentive or the encouragement for them to be part of solving these problems? I think, and I don't think you can be too Byzantine about it, but it is very useful to think of it as just as an overall measure of the value of that you're providing to your firm.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a good answer. I guess we have a little more time. We have a couple of minutes, so I'll just ask one more question. How do you measure your incident response culture? Is there some rule of thumb or mental model that you use to think about that?
I think like there's the technical maybe part of, let's say, the MTTR and like those kind of metrics. But when we are talking more about the culture itself, for me, it's how much time does it take for a developer to be like effective incident response, like a new member of the team, and how confident does he feel when he is doing this on call, like how when someone is like having his first on call, does he feel terrified? Like probably he is, but how much terrified is he? And like how
Or
does he
she.
feel, or she? Sorry, oh sorry, or she feel terrified, or does he feel like he has the back of the organization in helping him or the team members? So I think like choosing the people who just started is a very good measurement of the culture overall.
We did something, sorry to inject here, that I thought was very interesting. Initially we had a lot of pushback from execs at previous companies to incentivize fewer incidents and say, like, we should measure it and say we should have 0 incidents. And a bunch of us actually pushed back and said, no, that's a bad metric to track, because what it's going to drive is an incentive of people not trying new things, or they're going to hide them, because if that's the goal, then they will actually game the system and hide them. You want the opposite. You want the transparency. You want to understand when an incident is happening. So I think, in addition to what ETL is saying, there is an aspect here of like, are the types of incidents changing over time? Are you dealing with different types of problems versus the same ones over and over again? So you can actually, measure those types of things. If the same incident is happening in the same way repeatedly, then clearly you're not addressing something that you should be addressing. Whereas if your incidents change over time, then you understand that you are actually having a positive impact in those.
From my seat, I'm a little more distanced, so less nuanced answer. I look at 2 things. One, how many pages happened outside of business hours? The second one is how our SLOs are doing, right? One tracks impact on the team. The second one tracks sort of effectiveness.
Yeah, we watch things very similar to sort of what Pedro was saying, especially with customers implementing incident management. They say, well, what's the metric I should be watching? And they're usually expecting like it to be MTTR, right? Like let's drop that number straight out of the gate. And I think if you're early in implementation and you're trying to measure early like adoption and positivity around it, like it's actually the opposite, right? We're measuring like an initial increase in submission. People don't have to use these tools, right? Like they can hide this stuff, even if there's no incentive not to hide it other than don't use the tool. Like people just will not file them if they're not positive about the culture or the response process or who's going to get involved or what manager is going to show up at their door or all of these other things that are going to happen. So I actually think you can really measure most of this just through the idea of, are you seeing, especially on initial implementation of a process, like an increase in those numbers? And over time, it gets more nuanced. But straight out of the gate, that's really what you want to see. Your users, just like you watch your users, like, do they like my product? Well, are they using it? It's like a reasonable question to ask about most features inside of your product. You can ask that internally as well of your processes. Like, well, do people like our incident response process? Okay, well, are they using it? And more interesting, is it growing in use? Like, is it being used in ways you didn't expect? So yeah, I think we tend to just watch that metric actually out of the gate.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much, everybody, for participating. This has been an excellent session here. I've learned a lot.